standing for theater. So anytime that's like, it's like these very, you know, like theater type rhythms and lots of passion. So,
Okay, good.
yes, so I wanted to.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I appreciate it. Nice to meet you too. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. No, I'm not. Just I'm located here in San Antonio. I'm at Trinity. So, where are you from? Oklahoma, that's right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I know. So, university, large university, and Trinity is a small liberal arts college. So, yeah. So that's we have that. We have a couple of other large universities. University of Kevin Sumner, who's there. He's there, and then St. Mary's. So there's a number here. But with graduate programs, it's usually I'm a music. Yeah.
So,
in fact, our female vocal teacher is kind of a cheese, so you know that very well.
Okay, welcome back to our next paper session. Welcome back, our online viewers. Before we start the session, let me tell you just a little bit about an annual competition we have. It's called the Hewitt Oberdorfer Paper Award. And so it's a paper competition that is for any student members of our chapter. And so every May, I believe, there's a due date in May, students may submit a paper, which is supposed to be written as if read at a conference. And it will be judged by a panel of judges, and a winner may be selected. We actually didn't have a winner for a number of years, and there was a year without submissions also. But last year we had several submissions, and we have a winner. And so it is my joy to, in fact, so before I say that, is the person who wins the paper competition already qualified for presenting the paper at either the fall or the spring meeting, and it's up to the author of the paper to choose either the fall or the spring. So without further ado, it's my joy to announce the winner of the 2018 Hewitt Oberdorfer Award winner, Peng Liu. And he will speak about, so the paper is entitled Titles and Expressive Meanings, What Might Robert Schumann's Nachtstücke Hold. So welcome.
It was a common practice for Robert Schumann to ascribe poetic titles to his piano works. Although his titles often were criticized for their abstruseness by his contemporaries, including Clara Wieck, Schumann held firm to the belief that his titles offer some hints to help enhance listeners' understanding of the expressive content and the meaning in music. He claimed that a well-selected title, quote, prevents obvious and gross misunderstanding of the character of the piece and increases the impression produced by a piece of music, unquote. Initially titled Leichenfantasie, which means a corpse fantasy, Schumann's Nachtstücke Opus 23 is a set of 4 piano pieces published in 1840. Schumann originally attached individual titles to the 4 pieces of this piano cycle: A Funeral March, Strange Company, Nocturnal Revels, and Roundelay with the solo voices, that he later omitted after consulting with Clara, who believed that, quote, the audience, even the connoisseurs, won't be able to make anything of it, and will find fault with it, unquote, and suggested that he kept only the collective title. Schumann followed Clara's advice and eventually published the cycle without titles for the individual pieces. Since its publication, Nachtstücke has not received much attention from performers and music critics until recently, partly due to its relatively limited technical demands compared to Schumann's other piano works, as well as to the obscurity of the music's expressive intent. The issue of the cycle's obscurity was already implied in a review by the German composer-critic Karl Kosmely, published in 1844. In contrast to his much lengthier discussions of Schumann's other works in the same review, Kosmely simply describes the work with a few words, characterizing it as, quote, rhapsodic, arbitrary, something improvisational, and something like the moment of random mood dying away, unquote. Recent scholars, including Christine Morel and John McCausland, have sought to understanding this piano cycle in conjunction with E.T.A. Hoffman's similarly titled collection of stories. Drawing on Morel's and McCausland's work, this paper first examines the problematic correlations between the four movements and their original individual titles, and then probes the expressive meanings of this work by investigating the cultural connotations of its collective title. This paper attempts to shed some light on the musical interest and cultural significance of this piano cycle in 19th century German culture. The original movement titles given by Schumann, especially for number 1 and number 4, carry clear topical implications that listeners from his time would expect to hear in music. However, the music in many respects distorts or contradicts these topical implications, which may explain Clara's opposition to include these movement titles in the publication. The opening refrain in the first piece, measure 1 to 8, does not entirely obscure the character of a funeral march suggested by its original title. McCausland points out its resemblance to Chopin's famous funeral march prelude in C minor, opus 28. Both pieces exhibit slow march time, a low register, regular four-bar phrases, dotted rhythm featured mostly in the third beat of each measure, and even frequent tonal shifts. However, many other musical features in Schumann's work mark his funeral march as unconventional. First, except for the last beat of each measure, Schumann breaks the flow between every two notes in the refrain by using either an 8th or 16th notes rest. This rhythmic modification significantly undermines the sense of heaviness and seriousness typically associated with a funeral march, and it generates a special playing effect of holding back, as the tempo marking indicates. Secondly, starting with the diminished 7th chord in D minor, Schumann's march refrain features unsettled tonal ambiguity between D minor and C major until the measure 8, where an imperfect authentic cadence in C major finally comes to define the home key. Ending a funeral march in a major key undoubtedly challenges this topical convention, for it conveys something beyond a simply tragic mood. As a result, Schumann's funeral march is uncanny and conveys a somewhat eerie and sinister character. The recurrence of the refrain suggests its power to control, and its assertion in measure 101 to 104 culminates in its loudest dynamic fortissimo, thicker texture, and greatly expanded register. In contrast to the uncanny, broken, persistent march refrain, the episode suggests a different character, generally lyrical and gentle in nature. The alternation between two characters through the random form is represented more as a confrontation than an equal conversation. The piece ultimately dies away with a final fragmented reappearance of the march refrain, a typical Schumannesque touch. So now I'm going to play the opening part of this piece, this moment. Compared to the title for the first piece, the proposed title for the second piece, Strange Company, seems more fanciful and less intelligible. This piece presents an unusual take on a sectional roundel form, ABA-CBA. If one counts the number of the measures for the B section, which is the first episode, measure 25 to 65, and its later exact repetition, measure 94 to 132, one finds that the first episode occupies more than half the length of this piece. Why does Schumann build such an imbalanced structure? In fact, the dominance of the first episode suggests the expressive significance. The expressive variety in the first episode, its lyrical singing quality in measure 25 to 34, rhythmic elasticity through the extensive use of a ritardando 9 times in total, and sometimes rapturous liveliness by staccato, measure 37, 38, indicates a significant contrast to stiff, lefthless, and mechanical refrain from measure 1 to 24, where the brushing chordal motion in a rigid rhythmic pattern repeats over and over again in ever-increasing dynamic. The melodic contour, stepwise motion, off-tonic start, unsettled harmony, and chordal texture in the refrain are reminiscent of the refrain in number 1, but the much faster tempo, louder dynamics, and predictable accents on every other eighth note altogether mark it as a grotesque transformation of the march of the first piece. So now I'm going to play the refrain first. Hear the first episode, the B section. Set in a more lively tempo than the second piece, the third one contains many aspects that seem to mark it as an outlier of this set, such as the waltz-like triple meter, a distantly related key, a relatively independent trill section in a changed texture and tempo, and a little evident musical connection with the other pieces. The overall waltz-like character of this piece may support the original title, Nocturnal Revels. Schumann's treatment of the waltz, however, contradicts in certain ways the expectations of the genre. Schumann abandons the typical um-pa-pa pattern as accompaniment and instead uses rushing arpeggios on the left hand that are immediately answered by the chordal progression on the right hand with a sforzando mark on the first beat. Although this special texture is rarely seen in waltzes, it is not unprecedented. In fact, it is possible that Schumann was inspired by Schubert's Waltz D-146 No. 5, which uses a similar texture, as you can see in the example here. The rushing arpeggios and playing chords in the low register and extremely fast tempo impart to Schumann's waltz a sense of coldness and turbulence. In contrast with the grotesque and dashing refrain, the first episode, which also bears as much structural weight as does the first episode in the second piece, features a stretched out, sentimental melody. It sounds more like a groan than singing, suggested by its opening side gesture, measure 33 to 40, in a restricted range and a low register. So now let's hear the beginning part and then we will play the first episode. Hear the first episode. The first three pieces all present two clearly contrasting characters, an eerie, dark, cold, rigid, sometimes lifeless one that alternates with a more lyrical, gentle, supple, sometimes a sentimental one. The last piece, however, seems to compose against this duality by offering something much more consistently warm and peaceful. Although the opening diminished seventh chord does suggest an eerie character once again, it is soon replaced by a more consonant-dominant seventh chord prolonged under a fermata mark. Indicated to be played in a freestyle, the first two measures seems to function as a prelude. What follows is a simple nocturne-like song with a slow tempo, soft dynamic, straightforward harmony, and mostly homophonic texture. To 19th century minds, this lyrical conjunct melody with underlying strumming chords may remind of a typical romantic vocal nocturne, which, as shown by Geoffrey Kalberg, is usually sung by a man with a guitar accompaniment to women. The character as a love song is further evident in the melody in the middle section, measure 26 to 27 and measure 31 to 32, quoted from the beginning of the last song, Nehmen Sie Hinden diese Liebe in Beethoven's An die Ferne Geliebte, where the lyrics write, "Take then these songs that I send to you, beloved, sing them again in the evenings, to the sweet sounds of the lute," unquote. Apparently, Schumann wrote this song to his distant beloved at that time. However, this intimate love nocturne, again, does not conform to the suggested genre in the proposed title, Rundgesang, which to a 19th century audience connoted sociable singing between soloist and the chorus in a rondo form along with dancing or drinking. A title like this would be puzzling to an audience. Now let's hear the beginning part of this work. All in all, as Clara seems to have thought, Schumann's proposed titles in many respects are difficult to relate to the topical and rhetorical features of the music. Some scholars have attempted to explain Schumann's Nachtstücke through a comparison with the E.T.A. Hoffmann's collection of 8 short stories with the same title. It is evident that the strong hermeneutic implication of death in Schumann's first piece resonates with the Hoffmann stories, where death is a common theme throughout the whole collection. In fact, most romantic literary works involving the theme of night bear an association with death. Night is an omnipresent theme in European literature. Since the 18th century, night in literature has wide connotations, suggesting irrationality, fantasy, illusion, fear, and death, a world that is radically distinguished from reason, rationality, knowledge, morality, reality, and well-being featured in the daytime. Gottlieb Heinrich von Schubert's famous treatise on the philosophy of nature, titled The Night Side of the Science of Nature, was familiar to many romantics. Schubert in this work interpreted the mysterious behaviors such as sleeping, walking, and dreams as controlled by the strange, eerie night side of the universe. All of the above dark and negative associations with the night may explain the manifold relationships between night and the Gothic in the 18th century and early 19th century, as exemplified in Hoffmann's Der Sandmann. Many Gothic novels are set at night, and novels with night make use of many Gothic motifs. Schumann himself, at the age of 16, even began to work on a Gothic novel titled Zelena, but he never finished it. Monica Schmidt's Emmons offers some fragmentary stories from Zelena based on Schumann's diaries from the period between 1828 and 1830, and she concludes that those fragments, quote, consist of a series of nightly episodes during which several characters meet in a Gothic setting and discuss matters of mortality and immortality, unquote. A short scene in Midnight Piece from Zelena indicates Schumann's Gothic fantastic narrative of nightlife. I'll just read it through quickly. An unearthly and ghostly voice calls the somnambulist Zelena. The girl sits down on a grave, meets the skeleton, is embraced by him, and receives an acid case. And then the skeleton leads Zelena into the church, where he starts playing a waltz on the organ. Schumann's association of fantasy with the night side of life can also be seen in his review of Chopin's Tarantella, Opus 43. A piece in Chopin's most eccentric manner. One sees the whirling dancer obsessed by madness, and one feels whirly oneself. One cannot call this beautiful music, but we will certainly excuse the master's wild fantasies, for once he may show the night side of his inner life. More relevant to the case at hand, in a letter to Clara of April 7, 1839, Schumann interpreted some Gothic fantasies and images in his mind as a foreboding of his brother Eduard's death while composing Nachtstücke, which adds another layer of uncanny aspect to this piano cycle. Do you have any hope after such a letter? I don't have much, and yet I can't believe that Eduard could be dead. I wrote you of a foreboding. I had it between the 24th and 27th of March while working on a new composition. There's a passage in it which I kept coming back to. It's as if someone were sighing, "Oh God," with a heavy heart. I kept seeing funeral processions, coffins, unhappy, despairing people while I was composing. And when I was finished, I spent a long time searching for a title. I kept coming up with this, Leichenfantasie, which means corpse fantasy. Isn't that strange? I was often so deeply moved while I was composing that tears came to my eyes. And I didn't know why and I had no reason for it. Then Teresa, which is his sister-in-law, Teresa's letter came, and it became very clear. My concern about the wicked intentions of your father becomes totally insignificant compared to my great anxiety about Eduard. Night, however, does not always have negative meanings. It also embraces hope, peace, joy, and contemplation. Lillian first provides a brief survey of literature with a night theme from the late 18th century and early 19th centuries, including works by Goethe, Joseph Eichendorff, Eduard Muhlike, and the novelists, many of which Schumann were familiar with. Under the theme of night, these literary works represent a wide range of discrepant, contradictory images. For example, some poetry night in a negative way by associating it with the depressive melancholy, death, evil, and turbulence, such as Goethe's Faust I, the Ballet der Erlkönig, and the anonymous The Night Watches of Bonaventure. Other works, such as Goethe's Wander's Nachtlied I, Eichendorff's Nachtfeier, and Eduard Muhlike's At Midnight, project a positive image of night as a consoling medium that confers calm and tranquility. In Franz Schubert's Lied, with the same title Nachtstücke, the lyrics written by his friend Johann Baptist Mayhofer also show a contradictory picture of night. On the one hand, it features an old man who strides towards the forest on a mysterious night and is about to receive his death. On the other hand, the holy night called by the old man functions to lead him to the eternal peace through death. As a result, we see that the expressive contents of the night can range from melancholy and grave to joy, from turbulence to tranquility, from death to hope. The recognition of these wide-ranging cultural connotations of night is significant, for it resonates with the expressive variety and abundance in Schumann's set. ranging from an eerie funeral march associated with death in number 1 to a hopeful love song in number 4, from a stiff and leftless motion, number 2, the refrain, to a capricious, expressive contemplation, the first episode, number 2, from an abnormal, turbulent waltz, the refrain, number 3, to a restrained groan, the first episode, number 3. By looking at the broader context of the night-themed literary works in the Romantic period, we come to understand better the expressive meaning and cultural significance of Schumann's work. In all likelihood, the first composer to supply the title Nachtstücke to a piano cycle, Schumann by no means intended to imitate any single literary work in his music. Instead, he contributed greatly to the diverse, contradictory, and disorienting impressions of night in Romantic culture through the musical expressions in his Nachtstücke, ironically a much neglected and undervalued work. Here's a selection bibliography. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful paper. Any questions? Yes.
So thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. I guess my question is, you know, I'll say the question and you can say, oh, that's stupid. I'm wondering how much. I'm not trying to align this at all with Schumann's, insanity, but I'm wondering how much of this reflects maybe a late Gothic, into Romantic kind of association of the night with loosening all the bonds. Like you manage to hold it all together during the day, and be straightforward and upright, and then at night you kind of relax, and things like madness would be. We talk about the kind of the unusual aspects of this, and how much of this could allude to also that idea of the association of insanity with night, the night pieces, say in opera or things like that.
I think, well, the several parts of this, the movement, especially movement number 1, that sort of shows that idea, sort of fantasy, that kind of idea. But the point is that in other pieces, especially the last piece, that you hear a very peaceful love song, right? So you sort of have this contradictory image, I would say. I think the part that associating with sort of the myth or the fantasy, this madness, is quite common in Romantic, not just the literature, but also the paintings, as you can see throughout. Yeah. But this work in title as a whole, that still projects a sort of a contradictory images, including the one that you mentioned.
Other questions?
I'm curious about, I suppose the idea of the presence of voice. You talk about this sort of songful passage, and an association with voice and the presence of a protagonist, or the presence of kind of a locus of agency, or someone who's making a journey, or someone who's moving through a space or moving through a journey. So I wonder if you could talk a little more about the Hofmann connection, which I find fascinating because I don't know anything about Hofmann's collection. And do you know anything about the nature of protagonists in Hofmann's work?
Well, I wish I know more about that. Because I think some scholars have mentioned that in this work, especially McCausland's the book actually made a very strong association between Schumann's piano cycle with E.T. Hoffmann's fictions, and I think his argument was strongly relied on the original titles in this piano cycle, and he just chose like 4 another pieces written by Hoffmann, and the author was trying to make a sort of a parallel comparison between these 2 works and see is there any sort of a rhetorical similarities between these 2 different works. But I don't think I have the capability to give you more information about Hoffmann's novels. But yeah, that's something, yeah.
Thank you for your thought-provoking paper. I don't quite have my question fully formed yet, but it builds off of what she was saying about the contradictions in the song set between the titles and the expectations. And does that play a larger role in some of Schumann's other songs, like his song cycles? Like in Wunderschönen Monat Mai, for example. Like there's those contradictions of what we expect based on the text. And like, is that something more that Schumann does, or is that, and then
that's, yeah, I'm not quite a Schumann scholar on the lead especially, but I think that's worth researching, because you have for songs you have the text, right? You can look into it in more details, see how he did that. But I think the main problem is that in this piano cycle or in other his works, because in a letter in early 1830s that Clara wrote to Robert, saying that, well, she specifically referred to the piano cycle, the Kindersing. She says, well, the music is wonderful, but could you write something without a title? Because the titles are too poetic, and that people wouldn't really get what it's about, right? So I think that's sort of a constant problem for Schumann, especially when he wrote the music for non-song genres, especially like instrumental works. But for the songs, I'm not really, don't have much knowledge about that part. Does anyone know anything about Schumann's songs? That particular?
Well, that was just really interesting to bring up, like Clara Schumann's disapproval of the titles again. Is that because she wanted, as a performer, to go and like make her own interpretations of songs, and the composer put something on there, is that like against her traditional performance practices?
Right.
Yeah. To maintain this connection with the song cycle and the kind of sometimes cycle or piano works that is sometimes a collection, both of those groupings kind of fall into these categories of either it creates one coherent narrative and it's meant to be heard as a cycle, or this is a collection and it's not meant to be heard as a continuous narrative. I know some of his collections of piano pieces are easy to hear as a nice, tidy narrative, and the titles help with that.
Right.
Is that something that you're working with here, the presence or absence of an overall narrative in a way that is comparable to the song cycles? Or are you really looking at individual pieces for their particular content?
I mean, in this cycle, especially, I found there's a sort of a musical connection like throughout. For example, if you look at the most obvious thing is the key structure. If you look at the whole work, the first work is written in the C major, the second work F major, third work is the D flat, flat 6, and the last work end with the F major. So the F major is the home key, as you can see, and it's very common for Schumann, start a piano cycle with the off tonic key. So and also if you look at the last piece, the opening, it starts with the diminished 7th chord and dominant, right? Dominant is referred to the C chord. You have this sort of a conclusion in the last piece especially. Yeah, so that's one aspect for that I can answer you right now.
Great, let's thank him again. Before we get to the next paper, we have a special introduction and little speech. So, Drew, would you like to introduce? Come here.
So if I can introduce Dr. Tracy Cowden, who's the chair of the music department at UTSA, and of course has been wonderfully supportive of hosting this meeting here. I'd like to introduce you, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. We're glad to have you here on our downtown campus, which we don't even see all that often ourselves because we're up at our campus in the northwest part of the city. But we are just glad to have you here. I hope that you got to experience a little bit of Music Biz Day, which is kind of a crazy other side of what we do in our program here. And just welcome. Hope you have a great time in San Antonio while you're here. And we're just glad to have you. So thank you for being here.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much for providing all the support. It's wonderful to be here. We are moving on to our next paper, and for the viewers online, I want to mention that there is a handout, and the handout has been posted on our Facebook group. those who are not on Facebook can send me an email, and my email address is in the live chat on the YouTube channel, so I can email you the handout, which consists of musical examples that will not be displayed on here. So it's my privilege to introduce to you Dr. James McKay from Loyola University, who will speak about how low can you go, lower registral extremes and editorial alteration in Beethoven's piano music. Welcome.
Well, thank you. A couple of small corrections on the fly sheet with the list of musical examples. The Sonata in E is Opus 14, number 1, and the 2 Archduke examples are actually from the slow movement rather than the finale. Oh, how low can you go? Well, certain commentators, among them Donald Francis Tovey and Hans von Bülow, believed that Beethoven chafed against the registral restrictions of the classical forte piano. Others, such as Charles Rosen and Edwin Good, have asserted that Beethoven used the range that was available to him with great creativity. During Beethoven's lifetime, the piano expanded from 5 octaves from the F below the bass staff to the F above the treble staff to nearly 6½ octaves, expanding a 4th down to low C and an octave up to the higher F, which is the range of the Hammerklavier Sonata Opus 106 and many other late keyboard works. One can easily justify upward extensions of register in Beethoven's early piano music. Keyboards that extended beyond the F above the treble staff were in existence since at least the 1780s, and Beethoven used this extended upper range in an early piano trio without Opus 38 of 1790. However, downward extensions of range suggested by editors are more problematic, since keyboards that extended beyond the F below the bass staff were in common use only after about 1810. Notwithstanding the absence of these low notes on the instruments that existed during Beethoven's early and middle periods, this inconvenient fact did not dissuade certain 19th century editors from altering Beethoven's original text to include these notes, many of which remain in certain 20th century editions as well. This paper will examine a few of these passages from Beethoven's keyboard works up to about 1815, comparing the musical effect of Beethoven's original to the expanded range versions suggested by particular editors. Since most of the historic editions of Beethoven's keyboard music are now available online, courtesy of AMS-SW, the International Music Score Library Project, we can illustrate various readings of these passages with examples from them. Along the way, we will consider both the reasoning behind these registral changes and the musical effect of incorporating them into a performance of these works versus retaining the text as Beethoven published it. These alterations often vary widely between editions, displaying the shifting priorities of editors over the centuries. The editorial atmosphere gradually changed from the 19th century tendency to reshape older music according to a romantic ethos, to the late 20th century preference of discovering and preserving the original text to the extent it can be determined. Through these changing editorial priorities, we get a glimpse into the reception of Beethoven's music throughout multiple generations of musicians, how editors perceived these works, and how these editors interpreted and presented the works to the public at large. Though multiple editorial changes in Beethoven's early and middle period piano works obscure this fact, the first incontrovertible passage where he goes below the lower limit of the 5-octave forte piano occurs in the finale of his Sonata in A major, Opus 101, which was written roughly 1815 to 1816. It is a pivotal moment, highlighted in Beethoven's autograph and in the first edition with the indication contra E below the bass staff. This is your example 1, which shows the passage both in Beethoven's autograph and in the first edition published by Steiner in 1817. I've marked the particular moment with an arrow in your handout, both in the autograph and in the first edition. And I should mention the frenzied scribblings that didn't come out all that well in the autograph. It was sort of a pencil edition. Beethoven had originally alerted the publisher to actually write in the letter names next to all the notes in that low passage, which I suppose probably thankfully the publisher Steiner declined to do. However, since Beethoven drew attention to his use of this note in such an obvious manner, it follows that this is probably his first authentic use of the extended lower range in his piano music. Now, there is a possible exception from Beethoven's Archduke Trio Opus 97, which I will discuss later on in the paper. However, many of Beethoven's works dating as far back as the 1780s seem to call for similar or even greater downward extensions of range. And some editions, mainly from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, add these low notes based on the musical context. The first such passage dates all the way back to 1785, by the way, in Beethoven's Piano Quartet in D major without opus number 36, number 2, in which the editor adds a low E so that the piano's melodic shape conforms to the other instruments playing in unison. And this is representative of many examples from Beethoven's early period, which illustrates how editors made the decision to add notes below F, usually to match parallel passages elsewhere. His Piano Sonata in C major, Opus 2, number 3, second movement demonstrates this editorial tendency, and this is your example 2, which presents this passage in various editions. Some publications, among them the Cotta edition from Stuttgart, which served as the basis over here for the Oliver Ditson edition in the US, published in 1876, which you might know from the Schirmer reprint of 1923. Anyway, these publications do add a low E in measure 26 to preserve the octave texture, and again, I've used an arrow to help guide you to that passage. And that helps to match the parallel passages in measures 29 and 32. Notably, and sort of good for them, the Cotta Ditson edition does put this note in small type, which confirms its editorial provenance. As confirmed by the Artaria edition published in 1796, this unplayable low E is, of course, not in the original. It was not possible back then, of course. Though this note does appear in the Ricordi edition, edited by Alfred Casella and published in Milan in 1919, as well as even in the Henley edition of 1971, albeit in parentheses. Parenthetically, other publications, among them the Peters edition of 1920, the Schnabel edition of 1944, and an English edition of about 1810, write the E's an octave higher. Schnabel in particular condemns the low E found in many editions as, in his words, quite unnecessary. A related example from the same work, though vigorously contested in certain editions, occurs in the opening movement's final measures. Beethoven writes a broken octave pattern in both hands, but abandons it in the penultimate measures in the left hand, ostensibly due to range limitations. Retaining the broken octave pattern in the bass all the way to the final chord would require a downward expansion of range to the C that lies a fourth below the classical keyboard's lower limit. Granted, when Beethoven wrote this sonata in 1795, he would have had no expectation that such a low note would be playable in his lifetime. However, as editor Sigmund Leber remarks in the Cotta edition via an extended footnote, this is in your example 3, and I quote Leber here, "Had Beethoven had the compass of our modern pianos at his disposal, he would undoubtedly have written this passage thus," and here he illustrates continuing the broken octaves in the left hand down to the low C. Thus, it may therefore be played so. This is, of course, the crux of the matter. If Beethoven had had the compass of our modern piano at his disposal, well, what would he have done? This is far from an idle question. I've identified over 20 passages that Beethoven composed prior to Opus 101 that seemed to demand lower notes than the bottom F that was available to him at the time of composition. This is listed in your appendix, which is on the back of that single sheet with the list of the musical examples. And they run the gamut from 1785 up to and beyond the Opus 101. Regarding this specific editorial change, at least one editor provided a heated rebuttal. Alfred Casella states regarding this passage, and I quote, "Certain German editions, Leber for instance, advise, on account of the extension of the modern keyboard, to end with the left hand thus," and here Casella reproduces Leber's editorial suggestion, continuing the broken octave down to the low C. And then Casella continues, but this constitutes a sonorous anachronism which I cannot approve of, end quote. I must say, in listening to recordings of specific works that contain such passages, I've found about a 50-50 split between pianists who add the lower notes and those who retain Beethoven's original version. For instance, consider the final measures of his sonata in E major, opus 14, number 1, first movement. And this is your example 4. The two-note slurs in the bass from an octave F natural to a single upper E seems to call for the low E as well, preserving the octave texture. Virtually all editions, including recent ones, add this note, though usually in parentheses, though the Schenker edition, following the original Molo edition of 1799, omits it. In listening to various recordings of this movement, most performers follow the majority opinion and add the low E here. However, there is some merit in retaining Beethoven's original conception. The reduction of texture in the bass from the accented octave F to the single note E more easily permits the performer to touch the second note of the slur more lightly. Had Beethoven wanted to maintain the octaves, he could have transposed the entire gesture an octave higher. Thus, what seems at first to be a clear case for adding the lower note becomes rather more complicated upon closer examination. As Charles Rosen points out, and I quote, "When the conception of a movement or a passage is evidently shaped by the available range and Beethoven exploits the limitation, we ought to refrain from any revision," end quote. This is from Beethoven's Piano Sonatas, page 117, by the way, if you want to look it up. In this particular passage, Beethoven is not chafing against his keyboard's limited range. Instead, he exploits the limitation to support his intended phrasing in the bass. Other passages seem more obviously to tilt in favor of adding the lower notes, despite the fact that these notes would not be available to Beethoven for many years afterward. The musical context so clearly calls for the lower notes that it seems almost counterintuitive not to add them. Consider the extended octave passage in the finale of his sonata in F major, opus 54, beginning in measure 37. This is that little-known sonata between the Waldstein and the Appassionata, but it has some interesting merits in and of itself. This is your example 5, by the way, in which I present the passage in various editions. In the first edition, published in Vienna in 1806, Beethoven, or possibly the editor, writes single notes in the bass and indicates a doubling at the lower octave with an 8 below the score. This notation continues down to the low F, but the remainder of the passage, continuing further down to low D, lacks that indication. Virtually without exception, later editions add the octaves throughout the passage. The Schenker and Henley editions, in order to present Beethoven's original text in as pure a form as possible, put these added low notes in parentheses. Even in this passage, however, there is room for debate. As Rosen remarks, and I quote Rosen again here, "It is evident that Beethoven was forced to stop writing octaves in the bass because he had nothing below the F. It would not be unreasonable to continue adding the octaves. Nevertheless, the return of the octave doubling in bar 44 gives the end of the sequence added power and makes the upbeat to the following section more interesting," end quote. This again, I'm quoting Rosen from Beethoven's Piano Sonatas, this is page 119. Anyway, to continue with other examples, as the 19th century unfolded, Beethoven likely became aware that widespread access to keyboards with extended lower range was imminent, and occasionally wrote passages in the bass that presuppose the lower register. Consider the finale of the Ghost Trio in D major, opus 70, number 1, written in 1808. This is your example 6, which compares two early editions. In measures 28 through 31, Beethoven presents a variant of the opening measures, with the left-hand part of the piano presenting a quarter note line in an extreme lower register. The awkward ascending leap in measure 30 suggests that Beethoven's original text was a compromise due to range limitations. Here, retaining the lower register and using the low E would produce a much more satisfactory bass line. The Breitkopf and Hertel collected works from roughly 1862 does recommend adding the lower notes, indicating an octava bassa sign in parentheses below the passage in question, though this indication is absent in their first edition of 1809. So there was their original edition at the top of your example, and then their revised edition in 1862 that added the octave mark. At this relatively late date, 1862, one can assume, at the relatively late date of 1809, one can assume that Beethoven expected performers to add this low note if it was available to them. Since Viennese piano maker Nanette Streicher was building instruments with an expanded lower range by about 1808, it is likely that Beethoven wrote the work with such a keyboard in mind. The published version reflects this possibility, with the expectation that the lower notes so clearly implied by the context would be imminently available on contemporary keyboards on a wider basis. Finally, let us briefly consider the third movement of Beethoven's Archduke Trio, Opus 97, a lyrical adagio in which a single low E made it into print in the first edition. Composed in 1810-1811, and first performed in 1814 with the composer himself at the keyboard, the work's first edition, published in Vienna by Steiner, appeared shortly thereafter. The edition lacks a publication date, though the publication advertises for sale a number of other works by Beethoven from around the same time, including his Sonata in E minor, Opus 90, his Seventh Symphony, his Quartetto Serioso, Opus 95, and his final violin sonata, Opus 96. So you can get a sense of the general range of when the edition might have come out. The last mention of these works bears a publication date of 1816, 1 year prior to the Steiner edition of the Sonata in A major, Opus 101, with which we began, in which the contra E, Beethoven's first undeniably authentic note below the classical piano's low F, appeared in print. Turning back to the Archduke Trio, the slow movement's opening theme seems to imply the same contra E in measure 6, the goal of a descending passage in octaves, though the note is absent in the Steiner edition. It's the top of the page, example 7. Given that pianos could play the low E, existed in Vienna many years before the work's publication date, later editors assumed that adding this pitch was in accordance with Beethoven's musical intent. As such, the Breitkopf collected works of 1862 and the Henley edition of 1955, which is the bottom of example 7, both add the low E. Many parallel passages later in the movement show the same pattern. The Steiner edition omits the E, while later editions add it in parentheses in measure 62, 90, and 146 if you want to look it up later. However, measure 164, the final appearance of the low E in more recent editions, is a different and more interesting case. And this is your example 8, with the original edition at the top of the page and Henley at the bottom. Here, uniquely in the work, the Steiner edition also calls for the low E, matching the parallel passage a step higher from the preceding measure. Whether by design or simply by happy accident, this low E in the published version of Opus 97 predates the contra E of Opus 101 by roughly a year. Personally, I see the low E as a happy accident, though many Viennese keyboards that existed at the time of the work's composition were capable of playing it. The lack of fanfare surrounding its use in this passage, coupled with Beethoven's overt emphasis of low E in the finale of Opus 101, I believe marks the slightly later work rather than Opus 97 as his first conscious use of the expanded lower register in print in the passage with which we began in example 1. And to conclude briefly, as Charles Rosen rightly cautions, the advantage of retaining Beethoven's original text in his piano music, as opposed to altering it by extending the range, is equally balanced. Just because we have lower notes available on the modern piano than Beethoven had access to on the keyboards of his time is in itself insufficient rationale for arbitrarily rewriting his keyboard works with the modern instrument in mind. At the same time, one cannot arbitrarily dismiss all of the low notes suggested by certain editors simply because the instruments of Beethoven's time were incapable of playing them. Although Beethoven avoided using notes below the generally available low F in the published versions of his piano music until about 1815, Some instruments to which he had access prior to that year did have an extended lower register, permitting the changes in some of the musical examples discussed above. So even if they didn't appear in print, there is the possibility they might have been played in performance if circumstances permitted. As with any decisions that deviate from the score, context is paramount. No solution, however carefully considered, will prove equally satisfactory for every composition. What I found most interesting as I undertook this study is how different editions of Beethoven's keyboard works deal with issues of range. First editions published in Beethoven's lifetime presumably derive from the composer's autograph, while late 19th century editions made many alterations to Beethoven's text. As a reaction against these liberties with Beethoven's seeming intent, more recent editions have largely attempted to restore his original text, at least to the extent it could be determined from first editions and autographs when available. In many respects, the problem of extending the range and how it is resolved in various editions says more about the editors and their aims than it does about the music itself. Furthermore, it demonstrates the constantly shifting attitudes toward the musical object, touching upon issues of authenticity, fidelity to the text, and performance practice. Though the issue of lower range extension in Beethoven's piano music affects an infinitesimally small percentage of the measures that he wrote for the instrument, it remains a fascinating aspect of the musical content that warrants careful consideration and thoughtful weighing of options for anyone performing these works. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating paper. Questions?
I guess, because the piano is an expensive instrument, right?
Right.
So, just because it's available, people didn't all say, oh, you know what, there's a better piano out, let's, turn it in and get the version 4.0. I wonder to what extent so we have these instruments available, we have composers starting to write for these newer instruments. How much I guess my question is, how much does that condition maybe anxiety on the part of people with older instruments, and how concerned were they with the ability to play the new stuff out by Beethoven?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think in the reading I did about the Opus 101, one of the rationales advanced was that Beethoven drew attention to this low E as a way of suggesting, you really need this up-to-date instrument to play this work properly. Whereas in the older works, well, if you have it, fine, add it, but if not, the music works reasonably well without it. And Beethoven certainly, he was making a living primarily as a composer, at least after he was unable to play in public anymore, so he certainly had an eye to his music circulating as widely as possible, and there the more restrained use of range would have.
Some product placement.
Yeah, the more instruments could actually play his music effectively, I think the more that would impact sales positively, so I'm sure he had that in mind.
Other questions?
So say too bad he didn't have any connections with some of the instrument makers.
Well, they gave him instruments as a gift. Certainly, the extended upper range, it's often cited that the instrument he received from Erard directly influenced how he wrote for it in the Waldstein. I haven't heard similar things. I guess I've heard similar things concerning the lower register as well, connected to the Broadwood with the limited upper range, but the expanded lower range. And certain of his late works actually work within that 6-octave but lower range specifically.
Thank you for this paper. One thing that strikes me, so as a horn player playing Beethoven, where the instrument that I play today is fundamentally different from his, both in sound and technique. But one of the things I always find interesting is that throughout the 19th century, early 20th century of Beethoven's orchestra works especially, there was the practice of retution, right? A conductor would come in and change things to adapt it to the modern orchestra. And I find today we've kind of come to probably the worst possible solution, where we are so faithful to what Beethoven wrote, yet playing it on instruments that are so completely different.
Yeah, the old wine and new wineskins problem.
Yeah. So, and I think that's kind of an issue. Like, do you run into that in terms of intent? If your intent is to be faithful to Beethoven, does that come into it as well?
Yeah, I suppose it's an interesting problem. I know when I'm playing the works for fun in class, I mention this issue that, well, contextually, I will add the note here, but keep in mind that Beethoven didn't have access to it at the time. So I bring it up as a historic performance practice thing, but I usually try to take a more global picture of what the note is doing there before making a change of that sort. And it is kind of nice to imagine, well, if I only had that much space, you know, it's a different performing experience working with a 5-octave space as opposed to the 7 1/4 that we have today. So just physically, I think you approach the instrument, the music differently, and realize how much Beethoven is playing around with the extremes that were available to him than is evident on the modern instrument. So it has some influence between the ears.
So do you agree with Casella's prohibition? Do you feel like Casella's making a valid point here? Because frankly, it really looks like if he had that, he would have just continued the pattern.
Although then I guess a larger concern would be, well, that's the end of the recapitulation. What do you do when you get the same thing at the end of the exposition? Do you make a similar change? Because the same, you come up against that problem regardless of how much space you have if you want to treat all parallel passages as transpositions of each other.
So that was kind of a different thought that I was having is, are there examples of places where Beethoven could have done something in a lower octave but chose not to, and obviously there are, and so.
Yeah, well, I think the most interesting one for me, although I didn't touch upon it in the paper, is that although he highlights the low E in the finale of Opus 101, he deliberately withholds it in the slow introduction that precedes the finale. So just the fact that he had it available wouldn't have necessarily meant that he used it whenever possible. I think the withholding in that place where it seemed as if it should have been used in the slow introduction makes it all the more effective when he does use it later on in the piece. And it's a wonderful moment. It's the dominant pedal at the end of the development, so it's a key moment structurally. Just an ideal place to use that new sound for the first time in his keyboard writing, and to highlight it accordingly.
Seeing no more questions, let us thank you. That concludes our second paper session, and the third and last paper session will start at 3 p.m. That's when we will restart our live streaming, immediately followed then by our business meeting. Do you have any other announcements?
I don't think so.
Great, so we will, those who want to will go for lunch.
Will you stream the business meeting?